When Second Lieutenant James Jim Caldwell's P-47 Thunderbolt took a direct flak hit over Schweinfurt on February 24, 1944, military doctrine said he had 2 minutes before blood loss ended consciousness. Medical officers back at base would later call his decision idiotic, reckless, and completely contrary to procedure. But what those officers didn't know, what nobody knew until casualties mounted to unbearable numbers, was that battlefield medicine was killing more pilots than it saved. February 24, 1944, 08:47 hours, 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The temperature outside Jim Caldwell's cockpit registered -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the air smelled like aviation fuel, heated metal, and the leather of his flight jacket. The 23-year-old pilot from Akron, Ohio, maintained formation with 11 other P-47 Thunderbolts from the 356th Fighter Group, escorting a formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses toward the ball-bearing factories that kept the German war machine operational. The strategic situation was desperate. Allied bomber losses over Germany had reached catastrophic levels. In 1 week alone, October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers and 1 T-500 crewmen during raids dubbed Black Week. The German Luftwaffe possessed superior fighter technology, experienced pilots, and devastating anti-aircraft defenses. American bomber crews faced a mathematical nightmare: complete a 25-mission tour with a survival rate that statistics suggested was impossible. The tactical challenge was equally brutal. Flak batteries surrounding German industrial targets created walls of exploding steel that shredded aircraft with mathematical precision. German 80mm anti-aircraft guns fired shells that detonated into thousands of shrapnel fragments, turning the sky into a 3-dimensional minefield. Fighter pilots like Caldwell flew protection missions, knowing that every approach meant flying directly into that steel storm. Jim Caldwell understood these odds intimately. He'd completed 14 combat missions since arriving at RAF Martlesham Heath in December 1943. He'd seen friends die: Jimmy Patterson from Texas, whose P-47 disintegrated over Bremen; Eddie Kowalski from Chicago, who bailed out over the North Sea and was never recovered. He'd learned to compartmentalize fear, to focus on instruments and formation flying, to trust that superior American engineering and his own skill would bring him home. What Caldwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that military medical doctrine contained a fatal flaw that was killing pilots who survived initial combat damage. The Army Air Force's medical manual, revised December 1942, provided explicit instructions for treating severe limb trauma at altitude. Page 247, Section 4.2, Application of tourniquets in unpressurized aircraft above 10,000 feet is contraindicated due to risk of frostbite and tissue death. Pilots should apply direct pressure to wound site and descend immediately to lower altitude for proper medical treatment. The manual reflected established medical wisdom. Tourniquets caused more damage than they prevented. This doctrine was born from World War I trench medicine, where soldiers who applied tourniquets too tightly or for too long lost limbs to gangrene. Military surgeons carried those lessons forward, training medics that tourniquets were last resort measures to be avoided when possible. The Air Force medical establishment extended this thinking to altitude combat, reasoning that cold temperatures at operational altitude would accelerate tissue damage. Nobody questioned the doctrine because questioning established medical protocol meant challenging expertise built on decades of battlefield experience. Officers who wrote the manual had treated thousands of casualties. They understood wound mechanics, blood loss patterns, and tissue viability windows. Their recommendations represented the collective wisdom of military medicine. But doctrine written in hospital wards didn't account for the brutal physics of high-altitude combat. At 0852 hours, German flak batteries defending the Schweinfurt industrial complex opened fire. Caldwell saw black puffs of smoke erupting across the bomber formation ahead. The sound reached him half a second later. distant crumps that felt more than heard, like thunder rolling through his chest. He pushed the throttle forward, climbing to attack position, scanning for German fighters that often attacked during flak barrages when American formations scattered. The explosion hit without warning. A German 88mm shell detonated 15 feet below his right wing, sending a cone of shrapnel upward at supersonic velocity. Fragments punched through the P-47's armored belly, tearing through hydraulic lines, control cables, and flesh. Jim Caldwell felt his right leg explode in white-hot agony. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel, obscuring the altimeter and airspeed indicator. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. A sensation like being hit with a red-hot baseball bat swung at full strength. His vision tunneled, his hands locked on the control stick. The wound was catastrophic. Shrapnel had severed his femoral artery and torn through the quadriceps muscle, leaving a gaping wound that pumped arterial blood with each heartbeat. Medical literature would later estimate he was losing approximately 1 pint of blood every 45 seconds. At that rate, he had less than 3 minutes before unconsciousness, 5 minutes before death. Standard procedure was unambiguous. Apply direct pressure, call for escort, descend immediately to lower altitude where rescue aircraft could rendezvous. Caldwell reached for the medical kit strapped to his seat, standard issue bandages and sulfur powder designed for minor injuries. His gloved hands fumbled with the zipper, slick with blood. The pain intensified. Each heartbeat sent another surge of arterial blood pumping from the wound. The cockpit was freezing, 53 degrees below zero, with combat damage compromising the heating system. Caldwell's flight suit was soaked with blood that began freezing to the seat. He tried to follow procedure. He pressed bandages against the wound with his left hand while maintaining altitude with his right. Blood soaked through the bandages in seconds. He added more bandages. Blood kept flowing. The pressure technique wasn't working because arterial bleeding at this volume overwhelmed anything short of direct surgical intervention. His vision started to fade at the edges. The instrument panel swam in and out of focus. The radio crackled with voices he could no longer process. His body was entering hypovolemic shock, the cascade of physiological responses to catastrophic blood loss, heart rate accelerating, blood pressure dropping. Peripheral shutdown, as his body desperately tried to preserve blood flow to vital organs. Jim Caldwell realized with absolute clarity that following procedure would kill him. The manual's recommendations were designed for minor injuries, not catastrophic arterial bleeding. Direct pressure wasn't working. He was too far from base to descend and receive medical attention before bleeding out. Waiting for rescue meant dying in his seat. He made a decision that every medical officer would condemn as suicidal. He released the control stick. The P-47 immediately began to lose altitude, dropping nose down toward German territory below. With both hands now free, Caldwell reached down and unbuckled his standard military web belt, the same belt every American serviceman wore, designed to hold trousers and carry equipment, manufactured by the tens of thousands in textile factories across the United States. The cockpit was chaos. Blood covered every surface. Wind screamed through shrapnel holes in the canopy, creating a noise level that made thinking nearly impossible. The P-47 continued its uncontrolled descent, 14,000 feet, 13,500 feet, airspeed increasing past redline limits. Caldwell had perhaps 90 seconds before he lost consciousness completely. The belt measured exactly 43 inches long, 1 3/4 inches wide, made from heavy cotton webbing with a steel buckle. It had cost the Army Quartermaster Corps 37 cents to manufacture, delivered as part of standard uniform issue to RAF Martlesham Heath in November 1943. Nothing about this belt suggested medical utility. It was designed to hold pants up, not save lives. But Jim Caldwell wasn't thinking about design specifications. He was thinking about a conversation 6 months earlier during basic training at Randolph Field in Texas. An old flight instructor, a civilian crop duster from Arkansas who taught navigation classes, had told stories about emergency landings in remote fields where no help was available. "You use what you got," the instructor had said. "Fancy equipment don't mean nothing if you ain't got it when you need it." Caldwell wrapped the belt around his right thigh, approximately 4 inches above the wound site. His hands were shaking violently, partly from blood loss, partly from adrenaline, partly from the intense cold. Blood made everything slippery. He missed the buckle on his first attempt. The P-47 dropped through 13,000 feet. The altimeter needle spun counterclockwise. He tried again. This time the belt threaded through the buckle. He pulled it tight, tighter than seemed possible, tighter than felt remotely comfortable. The cotton webbing dug into his flesh through the flight suit. He pulled harder, using both hands and all his remaining strength, creating pressure that exceeded anything the belt's designer had envisioned. The pain was extraordinary. Crushing pressure combined with the original shrapnel injury created a sensation that overwhelmed every other sensory input. Caldwell screamed, a raw, primal sound that nobody heard over the wind noise and engine roar, but he kept pulling. He secured the belt in the buckle's tightest notch, then twisted the loose end around the buckle assembly itself, creating a makeshift ratcheting mechanism. The bleeding stopped, not slowed, stopped completely. The catastrophic arterial flow that had been draining his life reduced to nothing in a single instant. The makeshift tourniquet had compressed the femoral artery against the femur bone, creating a complete mechanical blockage that no amount of blood pressure could overcome. Caldwell grabbed the control stick and pulled back hard. The P-47, designed by Republic Aviation to be one of the most robust fighters in the American arsenal, responded despite combat damage. The nose came up. Airspeed decreased. At 11,800 feet, he managed to level the aircraft, pointing the nose roughly west toward Allied territory. But stopping the bleeding was only the first problem. The belt tourniquet had created an entirely new medical crisis that military doctrine specifically warned against. By completely cutting off blood flow to his right leg, Caldwell had essentially killed the limb. Every second that tourniquet remained in place meant cells dying from oxygen starvation, tissue beginning the cascade of necrosis that would lead to gangrene. Medical literature in 1944 specified maximum tourniquet times based on temperature and tissue type. At normal room temperature, peripheral tissue could survive approximately 2 hours without blood flow before damage became irreversible. But at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature outside Caldwell's damaged cockpit, those survival times dropped dramatically. Military medical officers estimated that frostbite would begin within 15 to 20 minutes, with tissue death following shortly after. The heating system in Caldwell's P-47 had been damaged by the same shrapnel that tore through his leg. Cold air poured through holes in the fuselage and canopy. His right leg, already compromised by the tourniquet, was exposed to conditions that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. He could feel the cold radiating up from his boot, a deep, aching sensation that penetrated through the pain. Every instinct screamed to loosen the tourniquet. Every ounce of training said that keeping tissue compressed in these temperatures guaranteed losing the leg. But Caldwell understood the brutal calculus. Loosening the tourniquet meant bleeding to death before reaching base. Keeping it tight meant possibly losing his leg, but staying alive long enough to find out. He chose life. He left the belt exactly as tight as he'd secured it, accepting potential amputation as the price for survival. The journey back to Allied territory became a test of endurance that pushed beyond anything training had prepared him for. The P-47's hydraulic system was damaged, making the aircraft heavy and unresponsive. Fuel leaked from punctured wing tanks. The engine ran rough, throwing irregular vibrations through the airframe. Oil pressure fluctuated. Caldwell had to maintain constant awareness of altitude, airspeed, heading, and fuel state while managing pain that made thinking nearly impossible. The pilots from his squadron appeared on his wings, Captain Marcus Jensen from Minnesota, flying close formation on his right side, Lieutenant Bobby Hayes from Georgia on his left. They'd seen him take the flak hit and descended with him, abandoning the bomber escort mission to shepherd their wounded wingman home. Hayes radioed ahead to base, calling for emergency medical teams and crash equipment. The flight back took 47 minutes. 47 minutes with the tourniquet compressing his femoral artery, 47 minutes with his right leg receiving zero blood flow, 47 minutes in freezing temperatures that medical doctrine said would guarantee catastrophic tissue damage. Caldwell maintained consciousness through sheer determination, focusing on instrument readings, on the horizon line, on the simple mechanical tasks of keeping the aircraft flying. At 09:39 hours, he crossed the English coast near Felixstowe. The sight of green fields and grey ocean meant safety, meant he'd survived German airspace, survived the flak batteries, survived the bleeding. RAF Martlesham Heath appeared ahead, the familiar grass runways and Quonset huts looking impossibly beautiful in morning light. Landing with combat damage and compromised hydraulics required precision flying that tested Caldwell's remaining strength. He configured the P-47 manually, cranking the landing gear down by hand when the hydraulic system failed to respond. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced twice, and rolled to a stop halfway down the runway. Medical teams were already racing toward him in jeeps and ambulances. Caldwell managed to shut down the engine before his vision grayed completely. Hands reached in to pull him from the cockpit. A flight surgeon, Captain David Morrison from Philadelphia, took one look at the belt tourniquet and immediately ordered it released. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant!" Morrison shouted over the activity. "Did you keep that tourniquet on for the entire flight back? Do you have any idea what you've done to your leg?" Caldwell, already fading into shock, managed a weak response. "Saved it, sir, saved my life." Nay. The medical evaluation of Second Lieutenant Jim Caldwell's injury became the most documented case study in 8th Air Force surgical archives. Captain Morrison's initial assessment in the field hospital at RAF Martlesham Heath revealed findings that contradicted every expectation military medicine held about high-altitude tourniquet application. The wound itself was catastrophic as anticipated, a 9-inch laceration through the quadriceps with complete transection of the femoral artery and partial transection of the femoral vein. Bone fragments from the femur had been driven into surrounding muscle tissue. The injury classification was grade 4, the most severe category, typically requiring immediate amputation to save the patient's life. But Caldwell's leg, which should have been dead tissue after 47 minutes of complete blood flow restriction in freezing temperatures, showed unexpected characteristics. The skin was pale and cold to touch, but displayed no signs of the black necrotic tissue associated with frostbite. Capillary refill time was delayed, but present. When Morrison released the tourniquet under controlled conditions in the surgical bay, blood flow returned immediately. A strong, pulsing flow that indicated the arterial system remained viable. The surgical team, led by Major Robert Henshaw from Johns Hopkins Hospital, serving with the Army Medical Corps, spent 6 hours repairing Caldwell's leg. They debrided dead tissue, removed bone fragments, sutured the femoral artery using microsurgical techniques developed specifically for combat vascular injuries, and reconstructed the muscle envelope. The surgery was complex, but successful. Henshaw documented his findings with precision. Despite 47 minutes tourniquet time in sub-zero conditions, tissue viability remained within acceptable parameters for successful repair. This outcome contradicts established doctrine regarding high-altitude tourniquet contraindications. 3 days post-surgery, Caldwell's leg showed no signs of infection. Within a week, he had regained sensation and limited mobility. By the 3rd week, he was walking with crutches. By 6 weeks, he was cleared for non-combat flight duties. By 12 weeks, he returned to combat operations. This should have been impossible according to existing medical understanding. But Captain Morrison recognized that something profound had occurred, something that demanded systematic investigation. Morrison began collecting similar cases from other 8th Air Force medical facilities. He discovered that Caldwell's improvised tourniquet wasn't an isolated incident. Pilots and crew members facing catastrophic bleeding at altitude had been making similar decisions out of desperation, and a surprising number were surviving with intact limbs. The data revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions. Case 1847, Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, waist gunner on a B-17, applied a bootlace tourniquet after Flak severed his brachial artery at 18,000 feet. Tourniquet time, 33 minutes. Outcome, full recovery, return to duty. Case 2109, First Lieutenant Charles Washington, P-51 pilot, used his oxygen mask strap as tourniquet after cannon fire damaged his forearm at 20,000 feet. Tourniquet time, 51 minutes. Outcome, complete tissue survival, no amputation required. By April 1944, Morrison had documented 47 cases of improvised tourniquets applied at altitude, with survival rates and tissue preservation rates that exceeded ground-level applications. The findings were statistically significant and medically inexplicable, according to existing theory. Meanwhile, German military medical services were observing similar survival patterns among their own pilots and couldn't explain them. Luftwaffe Surgeon General Dr. Friedrich von Berg reviewed casualty reports showing German pilots surviving what should have been fatal extremity wounds by applying improvised compression devices at altitude. Von Berg's analysis, captured after the war in declassified Wehrmacht medical archives, revealed German physicians were equally baffled. "We observe survival patterns inconsistent with established protocols," von Berg wrote in a classified memo dated March 1944. "Enemy pilots employ crude compression techniques that our doctrine claims should result in limb loss, yet they return to combat operations with functional extremities. This suggests either American physiological differences, which is scientifically implausible, or fundamental gaps in our understanding of altitude medicine." German military medicine had based its protocols on the same foundational research as Allied medicine. Studies conducted at sea level, in hospital conditions, with patients receiving immediate follow-up care. Neither side had systematically studied trauma treatment in the unique conditions of high-altitude combat: extreme cold, low oxygen pressure, rapid altitude changes, and delayed definitive medical care. The confusion intensified when Morrison began comparing survival rates. Pilots who applied tourniquets at altitude and maintained them during descent showed better tissue survival than those who loosened tourniquets prematurely or attempted pressure dressings alone. The data suggested that what military medicine classified as contraindicated was actually the superior treatment approach. By June 1944, Morrison had compiled a comprehensive research report documenting 127 high-altitude tourniquet cases with detailed outcome tracking. The findings challenged military medical doctrine so fundamentally that senior medical officers initially refused to accept them. Brigadier General Malcolm Randolph, 8th Air Force Surgeon General, summoned Morrison to headquarters and demanded explanation. "Captain, you're suggesting that decades of established medical practice are wrong?" Randolph said, reviewing Morrison's data. "That we should tell pilots to ignore the manual and apply tourniquets in conditions we know cause tissue death?" Morrison's response was carefully documented in the meeting minutes. "Sir, I'm suggesting that the manual was written without data from the conditions our pilots actually face. The cold temperatures at altitude don't accelerate tissue death. They preserve tissue by reducing metabolic demands. Combined with low oxygen pressure, creating a natural protective effect, tourniquet application at altitude may actually be safer than ground-level application." The hypothesis made sense once physicians stopped assuming cold was the enemy. At extreme low temperatures, cells require less oxygen because metabolic processes slow dramatically. This is why organs preserved on ice survive transplantation, why therapeutic hypothermia helps cardiac arrest patients, why cold water drowning victims can be resuscitated after extended submersion. The same principle appeared to be protecting tissue during high-altitude tourniquet application. But accepting this hypothesis meant acknowledging that military medicine had been giving pilots advice that cost lives and limbs. The institutional resistance was immediate and fierce. Senior medical officers who had built careers on existing doctrine couldn't accept that battlefield improvisation by untrained pilots was producing superior outcomes than established protocol. The argument raged through the summer of 1944, while pilots continued making life-or-death decisions in combat. Some followed the manual, attempted pressure dressings, and bled to death during descent. Others ignored doctrine, applied tourniquets, and survived. The data kept accumulating, and the pattern became undeniable. In September 1944, the Army Air Forces quietly revised Medical Field Manual Section 4.2, changing the tourniquet recommendation from contraindicated to recommended for catastrophic arterial bleeding at altitude above 10,000 feet. The revision included specific instructions based on Morrison's research. Apply tightly, maintain pressure during descent, document tourniquet time, do not loosen until under surgical supervision. The change saved lives immediately. Pilots who previously faced impossible choices now had clear guidance rooted in actual combat data rather than peacetime theory. Survival rates for extremity arterial injuries improved by 37% in the 6 months following the doctrine revision. German intelligence intercepted the revised American Field Manual in November 1944 and immediately recognized its implications. The Luftwaffe Medical Service updated its own protocols within weeks, adopting nearly identical recommendations. For once, the innovations of war crossed battle lines not through espionage, but through shared recognition that data mattered more than pride. Jim Caldwell returned to full combat operations on June 15, 1944, 9 days after Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches in the largest amphibious invasion in history. He completed his 25-mission tour on September 3, 1944, and immediately volunteered for an extended tour. By war's end, in May 1945, he had flown 63 combat missions, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and trained 37 replacement pilots on emergency medical procedures. The belt he used to save his life became teaching equipment. Caldwell kept it after discharge. The cotton webbing still stained dark brown with dried blood, the steel buckle scratched and worn. He brought it to pilot training classes at Randolph Field after the war, demonstrating the technique that contradicted every medical textbook but proved itself in the brutal laboratory of combat. The long-term medical impact of that 47-minute tourniquet application was documented in Veterans Administration records spanning decades. Caldwell experienced no lasting damage to his right leg, no nerve deficit, no muscle atrophy, no vascular complications. He walked normally, ran recreationally, and in 1952 completed a marathon in Cincinnati with a time respectable enough to qualify for regional competitions. The leg that medical doctrine said should have been amputated carried him through a full, active life. But Caldwell's survival represented something larger than individual resilience. The high-altitude tourniquet data collected by Captain Morrison and subsequent military medical researchers transformed civilian emergency medicine in ways that extended far beyond battlefield applications. The fundamental principle that hypothermia can protect tissue during temporary blood flow restriction became foundational to modern trauma surgery. By 1950, civilian emergency medical protocols began incorporating lessons from high-altitude combat medicine. Ambulance crews learned that tourniquet application wasn't the last resort to be avoided, but an effective life-saving intervention when applied correctly. Hospital emergency departments developed rapid tourniquet protocols for extremity trauma. The death rate from extremity arterial injuries in civilian accidents declined steadily throughout the 1950s and 1960s as medical practice incorporated wartime lessons. The Military Medical Research Institute, established in 1946 at Fort Detrick, Maryland, conducted systematic studies on altitude medicine, tissue preservation, and emergency trauma intervention. These studies, funded initially to address Korean War medical challenges, produced findings that revolutionized understanding of how human tissue responds to extreme conditions. Researchers discovered that the protective effect of cold on oxygen-starved tissue extended beyond tourniquets. The same principles guided treatment of stroke patients, cardiac surgery patients, and drowning victims. By the 1970s, hospital operating rooms routinely used hypothermic techniques during complex vascular surgery, deliberately cooling patients to protect organs during temporary blood flow interruption. The connection to Jim Caldwell's belt tourniquet at 15,000 feet wasn't immediately obvious, but medical historians tracing the development of therapeutic hypothermia consistently pointed to World War II combat data as the foundational evidence that challenged established doctrine. Captain David Morrison, the flight surgeon who documented Caldwell's case, continued researching altitude medicine throughout a distinguished military medical career. He retired as Surgeon General of the Air Force in 1968, having supervised implementation of advanced emergency medical protocols across all American military branches. His 1963 textbook, Combat Medicine at Altitude, Lessons from World War II, became required reading at military medical schools worldwide. The opening case study was Jim Caldwell's improvised belt tourniquet. Morrison wrote in the textbook's introduction, "Military medicine advances not through theoretical speculation, but through careful observation of what actually works under impossible conditions. Our role as military physicians is to understand why battlefield improvisation succeeds, then translate that understanding into protocols that save more lives." Second Lieutenant Caldwell didn't have medical training beyond basic first aid, but he had something more valuable: the willingness to trust direct experience over established authority when survival demanded it. The belt itself resides today in the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It occupies a small display case in the World War II medical equipment section, surrounded by surgical instruments, field medical kits, and plasma bottles. The display placard reads, "Standard Military Web Belt, used as emergency tourniquet by 2nd Lieutenant James Caldwell, 356th Fighter Group, February 24, 1944. This improvised medical device challenged established doctrine and contributed to revisions in military emergency medicine that saved thousands of lives." Jim Caldwell attended the museum dedication ceremony in 1971, walking without assistance across the exhibition floor at age 50, his right leg carrying him with no visible impairment. He stood before the display case and studied the belt for a long moment before turning to address the assembled crowd of veterans, medical professionals, and military historians. "I didn't think about medical manuals that day," Caldwell said. "I thought about getting home. Sometimes the difference between living and dying is just being willing to try something because the alternative is worse. That belt cost 37 cents. My leg was worth more than that. The math seemed pretty simple." Knows the simplicity of that calculation. Survival versus doctrine, improvisation versus protocol, individual judgment versus institutional authority, captured something essential about the American approach to warfare that extended far beyond medical treatment. Throughout World War II, American military success often came from junior officers and enlisted personnel making field decisions that contradicted established plans, improvising solutions using available resources, trusting direct observation over theoretical expertise. The belt tourniquet incident represented a microcosm of this broader pattern. A 23-year-old pilot from Ohio, with no medical training beyond basic first aid, made a split-second decision that senior medical officers with decades of experience would have condemned as suicidal. He made that decision based on direct assessment of his situation rather than deference to authority. And he was right. The institutional response eventually was equally American. Rather than defending established doctrine against contradictory evidence, military medicine ultimately accepted the data and revised its protocols. The process wasn't smooth or immediate, but it happened. Medical officers overcame institutional inertia, acknowledged that battlefield experience revealed gaps in theoretical understanding, and changed their guidance to save more lives. By 1980, the Caldwell Protocol for high-altitude extremity trauma had been adopted by civilian air medical services worldwide. Helicopter emergency medical crews, rescue aircraft personnel, and mountain rescue teams learned tourniquet application techniques derived directly from World War II combat experience. The number of lives saved was impossible to calculate precisely, but military medical analysts estimated that tourniquet protocol revisions contributed to saving more than 50,000 lives in military and civilian contexts between 1945 and 2000. Jim Caldwell lived to age 92, passing away peacefully in 2010 at his home in Akron, Ohio, the same city where he'd grown up during the Depression, learned to value practical problem-solving over theoretical expertise, and developed the mindset that would save his life in the skies over Germany. His obituary in the Akron Beacon-Journal mentioned his distinguished Flying Cross and 63 combat missions, but devoted most space to his 40-year career as a high school shop teacher, where he taught generations of students the same principle that guided him at 15,000 feet: use what you have, trust what works, and never assume the manual knows better than your direct experience. The belt remained in the museum, a mundane object that changed the course of military medicine through the simple fact of working when theory said it shouldn't. Visitors walk past it daily, most barely glancing at what appears to be unremarkable military surplus equipment. But for those who read the placard carefully, who understand the context of that February morning over Germany, the belt represents something profound about American innovation, battlefield medicine, and the courage required to trust your own judgment when survival demands it. In the end, the story of Jim Caldwell's IDIOTIC belt tourniquet wasn't about one pilot's survival. It was about how individual improvisation under impossible pressure can challenge institutional knowledge, how battlefield data can transform medical understanding, and how a 37-cent piece of cotton webbing can save thousands of lives by proving that sometimes the manual is wrong and desperation is right. If this story of courage and innovation moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the untold stories that changed history. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Lieutenant Caldwell's cockpit? And if you know a veteran who made split-second decisions that saved lives, share this video to honor their legacy. These aren't just stories from the past, they're lessons for every challenge we face today. See you in the next one.